The Tatsuya Ichihashi case stands as one of the most notorious criminal cases in Japan's history. The brutal murder of British expatriate Lindsay Hawker, followed by a tense year-long manhunt for her killer, shook the nation and garnered international attention. This documentary delves deep into the events surrounding the case, shedding light on Ichihashi's life, the details of the crime, the investigation, his elusiveness, and the impact this case had on Japanese society and law. It is a case that not only highlighted a shocking crime, but also touched on issues of safety, justice, and the lives of expatriates in Japan. Tatsuya Ichihashi was born on February 8, 1979, in the city of Aichi Prefecture, Japan. Raised in a relatively ordinary household, Ichihashi's early life did not indicate any significant problems or criminal tendencies. He was an intelligent student, graduating from university with a degree in science. After finishing school, he worked part-time in various jobs and had no prior criminal history. Despite leading an ordinary life outwardly, Ichihashi's personality would take a dark turn after meeting Lindsay Hawker. He later admitted that his motivations were rooted in personal frustrations, compounded by a desire for power and control that led to the horrific crime. Lindsay Hawker, a 22-year-old British woman from Coventry, arrived in Japan in 2006 to teach English at a conversation school. Lindsay had always been passionate about teaching and traveling, and Japan was a country she had long been interested in. She settled into a relatively safe and peaceful life in Chiba, teaching English to children and adults. Lindsay was introduced to Tatsuya Ichihashi after he expressed an interest in learning English and hired her for private lessons. On March 26, 2007, she was reported missing by friends and colleagues after she failed to return from one of her lessons. They grew increasingly worried, knowing that Lindsay would never disappear without contacting anyone. After several days of anxious searching, the police launched an investigation into her disappearance. On March 29, 2007, Lindsay's lifeless body was discovered in Ichihashi's apartment, stuffed inside a bathtub and buried under sand. A post-mortem revealed that Lindsay had been strangled to death, and the body showed signs of physical trauma. She had been sexually assaulted before her murder. The crime occurred after Lindsay entered Ichihashi's apartment for what she thought would be another regular lesson. According to Ichihashi's later confession, he lured her into his apartment, where he restrained her and assaulted her. When she struggled and screamed, he became panicked and murdered her by strangulation. In his attempt to cover up the crime, Ichihashi placed her body in a bathtub, filled it with sand, and tried to erase evidence of his involvement by disposing of his clothes and items that could link him to the crime. And once it was confirmed that she had been murdered, the police wasted no time in focusing their efforts on Tatsuya Ichihashi as the prime suspect. Investigators scoured his apartment, which was found in a state of disarray, clearly indicating that he had tried to clean up the crime scene in a frantic attempt to hide the evidence of his brutal act. The scene was telling, with disturbed furniture and traces of blood that had been hastily wiped away. In addition to the physical evidence, a witness had come forward, claiming to have seen Ichihashi leaving the area on the very day that Lindsay disappeared, a crucial piece of evidence that further implicated him in the crime. Despite the mounting evidence and growing suspicions, Ichihashi was nowhere to be found. Upon learning that he was a wanted man, he immediately went into hiding, vanishing without a trace. In response, the police issued an arrest warrant, and an exhaustive manhunt was launched to track him down. This case quickly escalated into one of the most high-profile criminal investigations in Japan's history, with the national police deploying all available resources in their efforts to locate him. Ichihashi's photograph was widely distributed across newspapers, television broadcasts, and digital platforms, becoming one of the most recognizable images in the country. His name became synonymous with the case, and the public was gripped by the ongoing search for the fugitive. The family of Lindsay, still reeling from the shocking loss of their beloved daughter and sister, made an emotional public appeal for any information that could help lead to Ichihashi's capture.
Help us get justice for this girl that she so rightly deserves.
Desperate for answers and justice, they urged anyone who might have seen anything unusual or had any knowledge of Ichihashi's whereabouts to come forward. Their heartfelt plea was broadcast across the nation, with Lindsay's family sharing their pain and the profound impact of her murder on their lives. The appeal not only galvanized the public to assist with the investigation, but also highlighted the deep sense of loss and devastation felt by those closest to Lindsay. Despite the intense pursuit, Ichihashi proved to be elusive, managing to evade capture for an astonishing 2 years. During this time, he changed his appearance drastically, undergoing plastic surgery to alter his facial features in a desperate bid to escape identification. This transformation allowed him to move around the country without raising suspicion, and he used a series of aliases to further cover his tracks. He lived a life on the run, moving between different regions of Japan, constantly staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Much of this period, Ichihashi was regarded as one of the most wanted criminals in Japan, and his name remained on the tip of everyone's tongue as the nation anxiously awaited his capture. The case captured the attention of the public, with many following every development. Yet Ichihashi's ability to evade justice made his eventual apprehension seem like an ever-elusive goal. The search for Tatsuya Ichihashi quickly became one of the most relentless and drawn-out manhunts in Japanese history, marked by twists, dead ends, and false leads. As the months turned into years, the investigation only grew more intense. Ichihashi's ability to remain hidden, despite widespread media coverage and relentless police efforts, seemed almost surreal. It was as if he had mastered the art of evasion, slipping through the fingers of law enforcement and disappearing into the shadows of society. Known for his cunning, Ichihashi managed to live under the radar for an extended period by constantly changing his appearance, utilizing different aliases, and adapting his identity to avoid detection. His altered persona allowed him to blend in, and although he was occasionally spotted in public by those who thought they recognized him, he always managed to escape capture, using his new look and fabricated background to stay one step ahead. The nation became increasingly captivated by the case, and the media coverage intensified. Tabloid newspapers and news outlets were consumed with reporting every new lead, and every false alarm became headline news. People across Japan speculated on Ichihashi's whereabouts and how he had been able to avoid the police for so long. There was growing public frustration as well, with many questioning whether the authorities were doing enough to track him down. The case had become a national obsession, and the longer Ichihashi remained free, the more the pressure mounted on the police to bring him to justice. His fugitive status created a sense of unease among the public, who were both horrified by the crime and fascinated by the mystery of his escape. But in the end, it was not through the tireless work of the authorities or the tips from the public that Ichihashi was captured. It was sheer luck. In November 2009, more than 2.5 years after Lindsay's brutal murder, the breakthrough finally came. A police officer in Osaka, who had seen Ichihashi's face countless times on wanted posters, happened to notice a man acting suspiciously in the area. The officer, his instincts sharpened by the years of the search, immediately thought something was amiss. Upon further observation, he grew even more suspicious of the man's behavior and decided to approach him. He asked to see his identification, and when the man complied, the officer's suspicions were confirmed. This was Tatsuya Ichihashi. His true identity was quickly verified, and Ichihashi was arrested on the spot, marking the end of one of Japan's most notorious and enduring manhunts.
黒い、頭から、黒いジャンバーのようなものを、すっぽりとかぶりまして、市橋容疑者、現在、今ですね、新幹線を降りてきました。すごいフラッシュの中、市橋容疑者が今ですね、東京駅のホームへ歩いて出てきました。市橋容疑者、ゆっくりとした足取りです。多くのですね、カメラがですね、規制線を乗り越えてしまったため、今ですね、様子を見ることはできません。市橋容疑者が、ゆっくりと新幹線ホームから降りてきまして、現在歩いています。非常に混乱しています。報道陣が多く取り囲みまして、市橋容疑者、悲鳴も上がっています。市橋容疑者、黒いジャンバーをすっぽりとかぶりまして、ゆっくりと歩いているんですが、もう前がですね、疲れて歩けません。この後階段になるんですが、大丈夫でしょうか。 市容疑者がですね、黒いジャンバーにすっぽりとかぶったままですね、今、東京駅の日本橋口の階段を降りていきました。多くの報道陣に囲まれましてね、非常に。
Following his dramatic arrest, Tatsuya Ichihashi was taken into custody and subjected to hours of intense interrogation by the police. Initially, Ichihashi staunchly denied any involvement in the murder of Lindsay Hawker, repeatedly asserting his innocence throughout the early stages of questioning. His answers were evasive, and his demeanor was cold and distant, reflecting a man determined to avoid the truth at all costs. However, as the hours wore on and the pressure of the investigation began to take its toll, Ichihashi's resolve started to crack. The weight of the evidence against him and the relentless questioning eventually broke his defenses. In a moment of despair, Ichihashi finally confessed to the murder, admitting that he was indeed responsible for Lindsay's death and the vast majority of cases. 4 days after Lindsay's death, the confession, though shocking, was not without its twists, as Ichihashi tried to justify his actions by claiming that the killing was not premeditated, but rather a result of panic and fear. According to him, the confrontation with Lindsay had escalated when she resisted his sexual advances, and in the heat of the moment, his emotions overwhelmed him. He described a chaotic struggle in which Lindsay attempted to fight him off, leading him to panic. The strangulation, he claimed, was a reaction to her resistance, an impulsive and unplanned act that spiraled out of control. Ichihashi expressed remorse for what he had done, yet he continued to maintain that the murder was an accident, born out of overwhelming emotions, not a deliberate act of violence. He insisted that he had never intended to kill Lindsay, painting himself as a man who had been caught in a tragic moment of irrationality. Ichihashi's trial began in 2011, marking the beginning of a tense and highly scrutinized legal battle. He was formally charged with the murder and sexual assault of Lindsay Hawker, and the courtroom became the stage for a fierce legal confrontation between the defense and the prosecution. The defense team worked tirelessly to argue for a lesser sentence, focusing on what they characterized as Ichihashi's apparent remorse and the panic-driven circumstances leading up to the crime. They sought to paint Ichihashi as a man who had acted in a state of acute distress, one who had been overwhelmed by fear and confusion. They argued that his actions were not the product of an inherently violent nature, but rather the result of a tragic lapse in judgment during a tense and chaotic encounter. His defense sought to convince the court that he was not a dangerous person, but rather someone who had made a grave mistake under extreme emotional pressure. According to the defense, his life prior to the crime showed no signs of violence or aggression, making the murder seem like an aberration from an otherwise normal existence. In stark contrast, the prosecution presented a narrative that painted Ichihashi as a cold, calculating individual who had committed a brutal act of violence and then tried to cover up his crime. They focused on the evidence of premeditation, such as Ichihashi's actions before, during, and after the murder. They pointed to his efforts to clean up the crime scene, which demonstrated a clear attempt to hide the evidence of his actions. The prosecution also emphasized Ichihashi's decision to go into hiding, using plastic surgery to alter his appearance and assume false identities as part of his elaborate plan to evade capture. They argued that these actions showed a deliberate effort to escape justice, undermining his claims of panic and remorse. Furthermore, the prosecution highlighted the brutality of the crime itself, how Lindsay, a bright and promising young woman, had been taken from her family in the most violent and senseless way. Lindsay's family, who attended the trial, were visibly distraught as they gave emotional testimony, recounting the devastating loss of their beloved daughter and sister. They shared their profound grief and their anger at the senselessness of Lindsay's death, demanding justice for the life that had been unjustly stolen from them. Their presence in the courtroom, their faces etched with sorrow, served as a stark reminder of the human cost of Ichihashi's actions. After a thorough and carefully deliberated trial, the court found Ichihashi guilty of both the murder and sexual assault of Lindsay Hawker. In 2012, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, a verdict that brought a sense of justice and closure to Lindsay's family and to the many people who had followed the case with a mixture of horror, fascination, and sympathy. While Ichihashi expressed some remorse for his actions during the trial, The brutality of the crime and his long evasion of justice weighed heavily in the court's decision. The fact that he had managed to elude capture for so long, undergoing plastic surgery and using various aliases to avoid detection, added to the sense of his guilt and the severity of his crime. Ultimately, the court concluded that Ichihashi's actions, including his attempts to cover up the murder and evade arrest, were consistent with the behavior of a man who had committed a heinous act of violence. The life sentence was seen as a fitting punishment for the crime he had committed, ensuring that Ichihashi would face a lifetime of confinement and atoning for the brutal act that had ended the life of an innocent young woman. The case of Tatsuya Ichihashi sent shockwaves through Japan, and its impact was felt not just in the country but around the world. The brutal murder of Lindsay Hawkers, a young British woman who had come to Japan to work and study, raised significant concerns about the safety of foreigners living in Japan. The tragic event highlighted the vulnerability of foreign nationals, particularly women, who may face unique challenges while living and working in a foreign country. It led to increased discussions about the safety measures in place for foreigners, especially those working in environments where they may be isolated or unfamiliar with local customs and legal protections. Lindsay's family, devastated by the loss of their beloved daughter, became vocal advocates for change. They channeled their grief into a relentless pursuit of justice, using their platform to demand better protections for foreigners in Japan. They campaigned for greater awareness of the specific challenges foreign nationals face when it comes to legal rights and access to support services, often finding themselves navigating an unfamiliar legal system in a language and culture they did not fully understand. The case shed light on the complexities of being a foreigner in Japan, and Lindsay's family became passionate about raising awareness of these difficulties, seeking reforms that would help protect future generations of foreign nationals living and working in Japan. The media, as well as advocacy groups, took up their call for better legal and social safeguards for foreigners, ensuring that Lindsay's tragic story would not be forgotten, and that other families would not suffer the same fate. The case also sparked a wider conversation about the psychological and societal factors that contribute to violent crimes. Ichihashi's background, his life before the murder, and his ability to evade capture for such a long period of time brought attention to the deeper psychological complexities that often accompany criminal behavior. How could someone seemingly lead a normal life, blending into society, only to commit such a heinous act? The investigation into Ichihashi's past revealed a man with no apparent history of violent behavior, leaving many to question what could drive a person to commit such a brutal crime. Psychologists and criminologists began to examine the psychological factors that may have influenced his actions, and his case became a focal point in discussions about the nature of criminal minds, how they can manipulate their surroundings, and the warning signs that may be missed. His ability to evade justice for 2 years, using plastic surgery to alter his appearance and constantly changing his location, sparked further debate about the complexities of human behavior, identity, and the lengths to which some individuals will go to avoid accountability. As of today, Tatsuya Ichihashi remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence for the murder and sexual assault of Lindsay Hawkers. His life sentence ensures that he will spend the rest of his days behind bars, with little hope for release. Since his conviction, there have been very few public statements from Ichihashi, and his silence has only added to the public's curiosity about his true feelings regarding the crime. The case of Tatsuya Ichihashi sparked a broader reflection on violent crime and the psychological factors behind it, forcing society to confront difficult questions about criminal motivations and human behavior. Ichihashi's ability to evade capture for years deepened the intrigue surrounding his case, highlighting the unpredictable nature of violence. Lindsay Hawkers' family, devastated by their loss, became advocates for justice, raising awareness about crime, punishment, and the protection of vulnerable individuals, particularly foreigners in Japan. Their efforts continue to influence discussions on criminal justice reform, serving as a reminder of the need for vigilance, compassion, and ongoing reform in addressing crime's consequences. If you like the content, please like, subscribe, and share the video with others. See you in the next video.